We're live. Are we live? We're live.
We are.
Hello, everyone. This isn't Comedy Dish, but I am Stephen Allen Green, and that is Brian Seff, a.k.a. Rick Wright. Hello, Rick.
Yeah, hello. I'm sorry, I'm getting a whole bunch of messages all at the same time. Yeah, good to see you, sir. So, things are odd in London.
I imagine so. I was there when Princess Diana died, and just I was in Edinburgh. I remember this. I was staying in this really cool house with a bunch of traveling artists and people, and they had the wireless, the radio on, and we were in the kitchen where we hung out. And then one of the news presenters on the BBC said, there's been some reports of a terrible car accident in Paris. Rumors are that the Princess Diana may have been involved. We'll keep you posted when we know more. And now sport. I'll never forget that. Yeah,
sure.
It's not like sports. It's now sport. So yes. I expected this guy named Sport. Hi, I'm Sport.
Yo, hey. It's interesting too that we're talking about 20 years ago, and it was 20 years ago also that the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret died. They both died in 2002, and that was really I knew so little about the royal family at that point. I said, well, who's this Queen Mother person?
Yeah, right.
I just was not paying attention to that. I was also, I had a moment a few years ago, right after Harry and Meghan got married, and how tourists were coming from all over the world to be at the wedding. And I made a comment at the quiz about, so all these people are coming, like, I wouldn't miss this for the world. I'm thinking, well, you're not invited. And somebody really got angry with me, thought I was trashing the royal family. But I do.
But the Brits, nobody trashes the royal family more than Brits. They think they're a bunch of tossers and toffs and inbred. And what the fuck are they doing? Still pretending to rule the country? They have nothing to do with the country.
Yeah, there's plenty of people that. Like Jeremy Corbyn was one of those that was right. In favor of just, ending the royal
dissolving the monarchy. They'll never dissolve the monarchy.
No, because there's too many people that believe in it.
There's too much money involved. It's too big of a business. It's the biggest business in England is the monarchy, not just tourism, but everything else that they're involved in. They own all the land. I owned a property in London, but I was informed very clearly early on that I just own the building and that I'm paying a lease to the leaseholder. The leaseholder is the person that owns the land. And no, I was the leaseholder. He was the freeholder. Yes. And even the freeholder doesn't really own the land, in that the Queen could wake up or the King can wake up any morning and go, I want my land back, please.
Yep. Yeah, it's, I always just thought, all these royal births and stuff, it's like I used to call it the luck of the zygote, because these kids and it showed up at now I forget which event it was, that the oldest son of William and Kate was acting up, was being a child, and I just thought, yeah, he's going to do that because he's not going to see any repercussions about it. So he can just be a total twat, I was kind of in favor of Harry and Meghan just saying, you know what, we want to have a life outside of this. We don't, whatever the reasons were, I kind of was rooting for them, especially because the Daily Mail was coming down on them so fiercely. So
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, we all saw this. This is what they have all these conspiracies about who killed Diana, but but it was the press that killed her. Everyone kind of knows that.
Well, there was one comic that I worked with. I think he was comparing, and one of his lines was, "So what's the difference between Prince Charles and Henry VIII?" Well, Henry VIII had two of his wives killed, and left it at that. And I thought, well, that's a pretty ballsy thing to say, but yeah.
You know who just messaged me was Bert Kearns. He's a producer, film producer, who made the documentary Telethon about Jerry Lewis and his telethon. He also made a documentary about OJ and the Kardashians.
Oh.
And he's very successful and good, talented. And he's been a fan of my Jerry Lewis travails. I'm going to see if I can get him involved here. Hang on. Let me see if I have his phone number. This was, this is the kind of thing that I have had 20 years to plan, and yet 20 minutes in actuality, because I was staying at the beach with my friends because it was too hot. Then I got up early and had to Uber because I needed some cash. Then I got some breakfast. Then I headed home here, and then that was it. So, let me see if I got his number. Let me call him.
Okay, then.
See what we get here.
I'm going to excuse myself for just a moment.
Mr. Kearns, it's Mr. Green. How are you?
Do you think she saw that it was the anniversary and dropped dead?
Yes, exactly. Hey, I'm doing a StreamYard on Facebook. It's like Zoom with my co-producing partner Rick Wright in England. We're doing this about Jerry. Do you want to join in? Can I send you the link? Or are you busy?
What time is it happening?
Now for like another hour.
Get on it. Send me the link, and if I get on, I'll go in and pop on it.
Okay, cool.
Is it to just listen or to be on it?
No, it's to be on it. I mean, you can listen to it by going to my Facebook page. But we want to talk about Jerry Lewis. This is 20 years ago today. Sergeant Jerry taught the band. I don't know. I'm not going to make a joke. Yeah, I'll send you the link. How would you like that? Through Facebook Messenger or email or phone or text?
Email is probably the best. So I'll try to get in. I'll try to get in there. I got it.
Okay, I know you're always busy. Go do your thing. Thank you.
All right, talk to you later.
Bye. Okay.
It sounds like a modicum of success.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been meeting people ever since this happened, from Sean Levy, who's still a great friend and who we did business together, to Bert Kearns, and of course, Julian Cranen, the Oscar-winning producer I'm working with on the movie, that just serendipitously have come into my life. Who the thread is they've had experiences, mostly bad, but not always bad, but are still fascinated with Jerry Lewis.
It's funny. I was talking about this just a little while ago to one of my housemates, and she didn't know who Jerry Lewis was. And then he was a comedy partner of Dean Martin in the 1950s. And she goes,
right.
Oh, so Martin and Lewis, that's, and I said, yeah, that's who he was.
Right.
But yeah, that's, I guess, Martin and Lewis definitely played in England. I mean,
well, they played the Palladium just about 50 years prior to the event I produced. And it was to sold out houses, I hear, although I think Sean Levy, who I invited, who's a biographer of Jerry Lewis, said in his book, I think, that the second show wasn't sold out. But this was the whole thing about me bringing Jerry. It's like me bringing you back to the Comedy Store or Comedy Day or something. You haven't been there in 30, 50 years. And, it was exciting back then, and now the place is half full and you're old and fat and forgetful and crazy.
Yeah. And, I don't know if I told you, I caught one glimpse of Jerry that entire day, as his dressing room door was slightly open. And I just saw the most miserable face, a very bloated person who just had this look on his face like, why am I here? And, and so it didn't surprise me that much if he had that kind of control over his body, that he could just say, Oh, I know. Uh, yeah, I'll have a seizure, and
Well, okay, so a couple of things. First of all, I've always felt, and I'm not quite sure we've demonstrated this in the screenplay version of this, but I always felt that Jerry was completely manipulated by Max. See, Max kept wanting to get on the show, kept asking me every time I'd come back to LA, every time I go to the Improv, every time I go to the Ha Ha Cafe or wherever comedy club, he would show up and he'd go, "What about that show in England? Can I get on it?" And I kept stalling him until finally one day he came up to me at the Improv and said, "I know Jerry Lewis. Would you like Jerry Lewis on your show?" And I knew what he meant. What he was saying was, "I can get you Jerry Lewis, but you have to agree to put me on the show." In fact, we had a conversation. Max, in the midst, I should put this in the screenplay. I keep running into these things that I should put into the screenplay. Max called me up at one point in the middle of the whole fracas, in the middle of the summer, and said, "I just want to make sure you're booking me because you want me, not because Jerry Lewis, right?" And I didn't know what that was about, but it turns out they were plotting this fake collapse and to commit fraud.
I just remember watching him perform at that show and going, "I'm sorry, I don't want to see a fat man talking about Viagra." There was just something about that just really.
What? I'm sorry, I missed that. A fat man talking about Viagra? What?
Max in his act.
Oh, Max.
Yeah, and
I didn't. Yeah, I mean, I respected his success, and he made me giggle, but that wasn't enough to get me to book you on my shows. I had to actually remove my own desires to laugh at the comedian I book and say, what's good for the show? What's good for this particular audience? And often the two, I loved you and Zach and Emo and Overton, everyone else, I don't know. I love Sheila, even though she didn't do well. But, yeah, it's to make me laugh, but that's last. But I just didn't think, well, Max didn't have the pulling power. I was getting desperate because, see, here's what happened. I needed a star, and I had been talking to Michael McKean and Harry Shearer and Christopher Guest and their manager about bringing Spinal Tap over. I met them and was talking with them. And I was talking with Mike Myers personally because we had Neil Malarkey in the first one, his old partner. I needed a big name.
Yes.
How it's like if you're producing a comedy gig, a local comedy gig in LA or New York, or, you want to have, Alonzo Bowden or, somebody who's got sort of a brand name as a decent comic, Bill Bailey, Alonzo Bowden. These are New York guys.
But yeah, you needed a comedy legend.
I needed someone really big, someone famous.
And I remember you said you were talking to Roseanne at one point.
Well, Roseanne was the year before, so I tried to get her for the 2001 show at the Edinburgh Playhouse, 3,300 seats. She was interested. And then I went back and forth with Bill Pentland, her ex-husband, who was negotiating for her for 3 weeks. Yeah, she's interested. I'll let you know tomorrow. I wait 2 days, I didn't hear anything. Hey, do you know anything? I mean, there's deadlines looming. I have to put ads in. I have to arrange for things. I have to move on if they're not going to do it. Finally, after 3 weeks, she said Bill Pentland came back and said, no, she can't do it. So then a year later, less than a year later, I go to Carlos and Charlie's. The nightclub no longer exists, which was owned by Shep Gordon, the manager of Alice Cooper. And I see Roseanne coming out there with a bunch of friends, and she was drunk. And I said, hey, we missed you at the show. It was maybe only 3 months after that show. And we missed you. Would have loved to have you. And she was drunk. And she looked at me and goes, you weren't offering me any money.
Yeah.
I mean, that's her job. Bill Pentland's fucking job as her manager at the time. Or I'm sorry, Bill, I don't know what your position was at the time, but you were communicating with me for Roseanne. Bill should have said, she'll do it if is there any money involved? Oh, money, yeah, let me see what I can do. I would have gladly thrown $5,000 or $10,000 towards Roseanne if I knew that was the issue. But I was providing first-class round-trip travel, 5-star hotel at the Caledonian in Edinburgh, and it was for a charity, not my charity. a charity launched by Princess Diana for drug abuse.
Yep.
You know, it's the same thing that Charles Fleischer pulled on me.
I was going to say that with Bill Pentland, that's surprising to me because by that time, she and Bill had been long divorced, but I guess he was still.
Yeah, but from what I've read from Bill's posts, he was like recently he put a post about Roseanne having this really nice property up in ranch or something in California, and it was his job to look after it well after they're divorced, because I think that makes sense. If you're a famous rich person and you want people around you that are related to you or know you want money, and you need people to do things like look after your ranch, you're going to likely cast someone from your family to do that.
Yeah, and they still had, they had a couple daughters together, so there was they had to stay in touch.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I always had, that was one of the. Well, I'm going to veer off the subject, so.
There is no subject today.
I was thinking, Bill. Bill was the reason that Roseanne came to see the Stupeds when we performed at LA Cabaret, and she loved it so much. She was actually talking about, this was just before she got the series, before Roseanne the series started. But she was saying, I'm doing a tour. I'd love to have you guys tour with me, and and we'll sing a couple songs with you backing and stuff like that. So, but then she got the series and things changed, and then she and Bill split up and the Tom Arnold stuff. And I only saw her once after she got famous, and she was in the Comedy Store with Tom, and they were wearing these shirts that I hadn't seen since the 60s. They were called surfer shirts that had white and wide color stripes, alternating like white and red or white and orange, that were really popular for about 2 years in the 60s. And they were both wearing them matching. So,
excuse me, Rick, I just noticed that Jonathan Sloman, who is an invite, is watching. I know he's probably at work and can't join in, but Jonathan, I came to know Jonathan. He's a Londoner, and he was in the audience that night, and we've been Facebook friends. I think we chatted once, so I gave him the link. I'm hoping he will join. In the meantime, let's play the famous announcement here.
Okay.
I was hoping we'd possibly get into dissecting exactly what happened with Jerry Lewis, but in the meantime, let's share this, and we'll get back to discussing things, because I want to get as much backstage stuff as I possibly can. So your browser has blocked your share screen. This happened last time. All right, what I'm going to have to do, I can't not share. So Chrome or Safari is not working either. I've been having so much problems with my computer. I've been meaning to get it fixed. You know what I can do? I can log in on my other computer. Hang on. In fact, I think that's what I'm going to be doing here. Let me grab the USB port from the desktop and put it into my laptop, and then I'm going to switch. This is all so professional, folks.
I remember those days when we had someone producing the show for a few weeks, and even then we still had technical problems. But I assume he's in another realm. Okay.
Rick,
Yeah.
Rick, I'm back.
Okay.
I'm back. I'm on the other better computer for this. My
Okay.
apologies. Do you need to, will you go to the loo? Go to the loo if you need to go to the loo.
I'll go to the loo, and but yeah, you
Okay.
sound better too. You're not distorting at all, so that's good. So
Good. My hair's a mess.
I'll be back.
Hi, folks.
Go totally
Stephen
bald.
Allen Green here. Yeah, this is embarrassing, all the way around. But let me get the. Hang on. Oh, for fuck's sake. This just is fucked up. All right, folks. Rick will be right back. This is turning into a disaster like we've never seen before. Okay, hi. So Rick has gone to he's gone to an important meeting. He'll be back in a few minutes. This is Stephen Allen Green broadcasting to you. Wait, Bert is joining us now. This is good. Bert the Kearns. Bert the Kearns is here, ladies and gentlemen. Bert Kearns. Hi, Bert. Thanks for joining us. Last minute invite. Ladies and gentlemen, Bert is a very successful Hollywood producer, focused mainly on interesting tabloidic, in a way, documentaries on Kim Kardashian, O.J. Simpson, and, of course, Telethon with Jerry. And he's got a new book or documentary out of Lawrence Tierney. Which is it, Bert?
Got a new book coming
go.
out in November. Lawrence Tierney, Hollywood's real-life tough guy. The story of a man who came to Hollywood in 1943, drank his way and fought his way out of a career, and then made a comeback with Reservoir Dogs later in life. Great story. Great character.
And he was an actual tough guy. Let me turn my light on. He was an actual tough guy in real life, right? He wasn't just a gentleman. He wasn't like Cagney, who was a gentleman off camera. Was he?
No, he was a lunatic. Yeah, he had mental issues and was a diehard alcoholic through most of
Bert, good to meet you. And who are you talking about?
Yeah, this is Brian Seff, whose stage name was Rick Wright. He was a half of Rick and Ruby. They were a famous double act in the 70s. Robin Williams, Pee Wee Herman opening and on
Very
TV
cool.
shows.
But who were you talking about?
You,
Lawrence Tierney. You.
The actor
Lawrence Tierney, the tough guy actor who we all know from. Okay, Bert, I did this line in my act in England for years, which was really funny. I did this series of mixed impressions. So now it's my impression of Top Cat as Reservoir Dogs, and it goes like this. Got the punchline, but you can't call me Mr. Pink, something like that. So it's Top Cat. It was, the character played by Marvin Kaplan. Reservoir Dogs, Top Cat.
It was Arnold Stang that was the voice of Top Cat.
Close enough.
Right, Arnold Stang.
Yeah.
And Marvin Kaplan was the voice of one of the other cats. I can't remember.
Who I had dinner with at Kate Manalini's when they were both open and alive. So, Mr. Kearns, Bert, whatever you like to be called, today is the 20th anniversary, and the Queen fucking has to steal my thunder. Thank you very much. The King of Comedy dies 20 years ago. Now the Queen.
She probably saw that it was the anniversary, and
she wanted to do me in.
One's upstage. That's why Freddie Mercury died the same day as Ollie Joe Prater, the Comedy Store comic.
Remember Ollie Joe? Yeah.
Yes.
So you knew Jerry, Bert, and you made a wonderful documentary called Telethon about Jerry's preparation, production of the famous Telethon in Vegas, and it was very interesting. You really captured his charm and his magic as a person, and that was the thing that nobody understood. Everyone was saying, "Why are you working with that asshole? Why are you bringing that fucker into the picture, Harry Stephen? You built too much." And aside from him being one of my childhood idols and just my adult admiration of his success and his comedy genius, no matter what people say about it, he was magnetic to be around. You forget your own thoughts when you're near him. He had it's beyond charisma. And so I was in a way Svengali'd into it. I am not saying I'm the
I think
victim
it's
here.
especially our age. You and I, Steve and I, Brian, I don't know how old you are, but Steve and I think we're both 1956 kids.
No, I was born before the Queen ascended to the throne. No.
Right.
Harry Truman
She's
was
been around my whole life.
Yeah.
But we were,
Yeah.
but I was born, and I'm from that generation, brought up in the 60s, in that sweet spot of Jerry Lewis's career, where on the weekends we'd be dumped off at the movie theater and see double features of Jerry Lewis movies. We grew up with that, and putting on Muscular Dystrophy Association carnivals in our driveway. And then when you got a little bit older and got into drugs and alcohol and stuff in the 70s, it was a matter of sitting up and watching the telethon and watching that psychodrama through the 70s and 80s of Jerry Lewis. I've always considered Jerry Lewis to be the ultimate entertainer of the 20th century. And
I must say, it moved me whenever he would end the telethon by singing "You'll Never Walk Alone," and he clearly, could barely stand up. He was, he'd been up for about 40 hours.
In 1987, I was working at NBC, and I had a friend who worked as the assistant director for Saturday Night Live. She got the gig to be the assistant director on the telethon at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. And I said to her, please, get me a gig, get me a job on the telethon. I want to be there with Jerry and stay up for the entire telethon with him. And I want to see at the very end, when he sings "You'll Never Walk Alone," if he's faking it.
Oh.
And I got there, I got the job at Caesar's. They brought me into the production trailer. The first thing they did was they said, this job is, I was a production assistant. I just took any job they would give me. They handed me a stack of papers. And this was before, computers, et cetera. This was the rundown for the show. They said, this job is from Jerry. What you have to do is, and they handed me some whiteout and they put me in front of a typewriter. At the top of each page of this 300-page show rundown, it said 1987 Muscular Dystrophy Telethon. I had to white out muscular dystrophy and type in Jerry Lewis. So it would say 1987 Jerry Lewis Telethon. I was in heaven. Anyway, to make a long story a little longer, got to the very end, was standing there right next to the camera when Jerry closed the telethon. He sang "You'll Never Walk Alone." Did that mic drop, put the mic down on the stool, walked off the stage and into the arms of his wife, where he wept copiously, nonstop for 5 minutes.
Wow.
It was the real deal. Jerry was the real deal.
It was pretty convincing, I would say. By the way, is that his picture behind you? I thought so.
That's his picture behind me. And I've got 2 Jerry Lewis tattoos. I think most people, the lucky ones, have 1. I have 2 Jerry Lewis tattoos.
You have 2. Let's see them. Can we see any of them here, considering our guidelines?
Where are we? I'm going to move this around a bit. There he is. There's a Hirschfeld.
Oh, wow.
No, I don't know if you can see it. I got to move my arm up. I can't really.
Yeah.
And then I've got the traditional. Where is he there? Where'd he go? There he is.
Oh, yeah.
Jerry Lewis. There, yeah.
Recognize that one.
There you go. But,
let's. Sorry, go on, Bert.
I was just going to say, with the good and the bad, the neediness, the arrogance, the insanity, the talent, I think Jerry Lewis had it all. And you had to, take the good with the bad. When I spent that week with him, when we did the coverage of the telethon that was later turned into that kind of bootleg documentary, Jerry had his tantrums when he didn't have his Eskimo. They couldn't find his Eskimo pies in the refrigerator they had for him. He had his tantrum there. He went crazy a couple of times, and he had that temper. But at the same time, he knew he had cameras around him, so he loved that. So he was on his best behavior as well.
Well, do you think this is a theory I've had? I think Julian Cranon, who you may know, who's the Oscar-winning producer, who had bought Sean Levy, who the author,
sure,
not the filmmaker, right? Sean.
Yeah.
And so Sean wrote this great book called The King of Comedy, and Julian bought the film rights to it. So after the Palladium show, a bunch of us came back to my flat in London, and Paul Provenza, who was a comedian on the show, said, you got to read Sean Levy's book. I ended up reading the book 7 times, hooking up with Sean, and bought the film rights to his book about London in the swinging 60s.
Mm-hmm.
and then I met with lawyers on 7 different sets of lawyers on both sides of the Atlantic, whether to sue and whether it was worth it. And I ended up talking to Peter Graham, who was my showrunner, and Peter said, just do a one-man show about this. It might be worth it. So he connected me with John Dowie, who worked with John Innes, who you did a documentary about, or with
Neil Innes.
not John Innes, Neil Innes, right?
Yeah.
And so we come up with this one-man show, and then Julian saw it and said, let's make a movie. He actually stood up at the dining room table. But let me share with you and everyone, you've seen all this stuff, but let me just share with the audience one more time. Well, there's never one more time with me. The 60-second video of...
Yes, another 5 years, I have a 25th anniversary show.
Yeah, I don't think I think, my obsessions and my OCD is just... It's really got to cut the fuck down. So this is what happened. I went out on stage and hit the play. Come on, play's been hit. Hit again.
There, it's doing something.
Here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a serious announcement to make. About 10 minutes ago, Jerry was taken seriously ill and was taken to hospital. I'm terribly sorry, but I'm more concerned about Jerry's health. And it's a very ironic way to end this night. So I thank you all for coming. Please support the charity. Please forgive the situation if you can, and pray for Jerry. Thank you for coming. I'm terribly sorry. Good night.
There's the orchestra that he had me pay $25,000 for. All right, let me stop sharing here. All right, I want to get your initial. I want to get your initial impressions of this, Bert. When you first heard about this, because you had been following the Jerry Lewis storyline and Lifeline before you ever heard of me, and you found my show randomly on YouTube, according to your account. And when you heard about this, what's the first thing that went through your mind?
Initially, when we first saw the news accounts, you thought that Jerry perhaps was very ill. I mean, Jerry at the time, I think he had the steroids, he had the huge ballooned head, but still continued to, because his great ego, continued to perform despite that. When I heard the story behind it, made more sense that Jerry didn't want to go on. Jerry may have pulled something there. I think that in the end, it might have been a combination of the two. I wouldn't put it past Jerry for sure.
Did he have that kind of control over his body that he could actually have a seizure? Just on calling for it. I mean,
well, he was the king of the pratfalls, and we don't know. Okay, we as in nobody knows how a genius mind works. In fact, I don't even think the genius knows. And so the biggest question that haunted me for literally, I think it was 7 or 8 years in London, New York, and LA was, did Jerry Lewis fake his collapse? Meaning, did he purposely?
He wasn't taken to a hospital, was he? I understand he was taken to his hotel.
Yeah,
that's right. The ambulance was called, and they went right to the Dorchester. This was confirmed by the London Ambulance Service.
Yeah, he felt like he was he was the Beatles being rushed back to his hotel in an ambulance, so nobody would know it was him. But yeah, that's right. That's where the clue resides, I think.
Well, you said something very interesting. He feels like the Beatles. I think what was one of the things that was fascinating to me about dealing with Jerry Lewis, and I mean Jerry Lewis when I dealt with him, because I think he's like a tree with rungs. I think he's so many different Jerry Lewises. But the Jerry Lewis I dealt with at the time, it felt like he had imposter syndrome. he didn't really seem to understand why people cared or why they hated him or what the big deal was. And then the next minute he'd be like, of course, I invented God. I invented everything. I invented this, but half the time it seemed like he was a little boy, 9-year-old boy, crying to be let out of this 76-year-old man. And that's where he and I connected. I recognized that. And I also was able to talk to the 9-year-old boy to get him to do things as best as I could. I never scolded the 76-year-old Jerry Lewis. I was always talking to the 9-year-old inside of him.
Well, Jerry acknowledged that. I remember I did an interview with Jerry. We actually republished part of it on Labor Day on the Legsville website. That where I asked Jerry, I said, "Do you have any apologies to people, for your behavior over the years?" And he was like, Jerry never meant to hurt anybody. Jerry was, and he referred to himself in a third person as if this Jerry was this kid and it wasn't him. And it was like, okay, yeah, Jerry apologized, and he says, I have no apologies for Jerry. I'm sure he wasn't trying to hurt anyone.
Well, I'll tell you something. I know Brian wants to get in here, but I'll tell you something about this. So this event happened in 2002. So I lost everything in London in 2009. Was back in LA and dealing with all this movie potential and having to figure things out financially all of a sudden again. And I kept seeing Jerry on the news, and I kept thinking, I'm fucking broke now. This guy basically stole money from me. Should I even bother asking for it back? But then again, fuck it. Why not? And about 5 or 6 years into this, it took me a while, maybe 4 actually. I called him up, and before you call somebody up, you're thinking, I'm going to say, you son of a bitch. You know what you did to me, blah, 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 blah. And then when he finally gets on the phone, you go, hey, Jerry, how you doing?
Yeah.
Jerry, I just wanted to talk to you about what happened. We never talked about what happened that night. Sure, let's talk. And I said, and I kind of couched everything in the British version of reverse psychology, where you couch everything in an apology, where I'm sorry that we had the orchestra and we weren't able to get your music, meaning you forgot your fucking music. And
you also didn't show up for the rehearsal either.
Didn't show up for the rehearsal, no music, locked yourself in the dressing room, tried to have me, the producer, thrown out of the theater. I booked Daniel Kitson, who I had no idea his opening line was going to be so insulting, and on and on and on and on and on. But then I would sort of say, but then you did this, and then you did this, and you did that. You didn't have to do this, but you didn't have to yell at me, and you did that. And this is what I'm getting to. Jerry said, did he do that? It almost blew my fucking mind, Bert. It was like he referred to himself in the third person, like you said.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know that this was actually, you did talk to him.
Yeah, about 4 years after the event. I was back in LA. No. The event was 2002. I talked to him perhaps in 2010 or 2011.
Right.
And I lost all my credit. I had no job resume in America for 25 years. We were losing 800,000 jobs a month in this country in 2008. It just went on and on and on. I didn't have a car, didn't have the know-how, and I didn't want to work. I'll admit that. So I was trying to set something up. I was trying to find work, and I thought, the one thing that Jerry can't argue about is the orchestra. I provided the orchestra for him for $25,000, and he fucked up. So how about just, it's like when I called him on the phone in 2014, I think, 2014, and we had for a while Mark Rydell, the director, attached to our movie, but then we started to realize that Mark was just kind of losing it, acumenly wise, perhaps. And I called him up again, and I said, Jerry, I'm in a spot. Can you? And he goes, you're number 9. And I go, what? He goes, you're number 9. And I go, what do you mean I'm number 9? He goes, you're the 9th person to call me up and ask for money. What do you want? And I should have said, and I regret this, oh, yeah, I'm the 9th person to have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to honor you at the London Palladium, and you fucked me over. Does that happen 8 other times? Instead, I sensed his ongoing old age. And I still had respect for him. And I said, well, Jerry, I'll tell you what, forget all that, but there is a movie in development. Julian Creighton, Oscar-winning producer, Mark Rydell, potential director. Jack Black was interested in playing me at the time through his agent. And Jerry said, you get someone like Mark Rydell, and I'm in. So Jerry basically was willing to have his idiocy betrayed on film by me and my by my writing, screenwriting fingers.
One thing I was going to ask you, did Jerry have any, aside from Max Alexander, did he have any contact with the other comedians who were there to honor him that night? And did he have any recognition of the fact that, he had some great young talent there?
That's a good question.
I doubt it.
Well, I mean, Tamsin, my ex-wife who was producing the show, he allowed her backstage, and she was looking after him. And I think Rick Overton went backstage. I think Bobcat Goldthwait did. Bobcat really wanted to do this show, and he said, "I'll do it if I can present the honor to Jerry." And I tell you, when I get at my most extreme paranoid state, late at night, 3 a.m, looking at the ceiling, this whole thing was planned. I mean, I do believe this all happened because I wouldn't book Max, and Max goes to his friend Jerry and says, look, this prick Stephen Allen Green that nobody knows has a show in England. He won't put me on it, but why don't you agree to do it, and then we both can go and have great fun at his expense. And they planned, Jerry, right before he got on the plane to come to England, he calls me and Tamsin up and says, I'm not getting on that plane unless there's a tank of oxygen on board. Hangs up, and we're literally talking to the airline pilots, literally, from planes going into London and leaving London. And that's how we had to do it. We had to talk to the tower that was, checking in. One of them did have a tank of oxygen. But the point is that when Jerry's collapsed at just the right time, an oxygen tank was brought to him. And then I will never forget this. Max and Jeff Lowe and all the other Jerry Lewis entourage people there at my expense stood around Jerry's body on the side of the stage. And the only visual metaphor I can think of is in Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights, when that woman is getting stooped on the basketball court and everyone's standing around looking at it. So in other words, blocking the view. You couldn't see what was going on. And it was a weird analogy, but I was like mixing sex and death. One of my favorite movies. But there was that. There was just a lot of, I've been set up by a master. I was conned.
Yeah. That's what was going through my mind, because I was just a few feet away from the side door, entrance to the backstage. I was sitting in the actual audience seats, but I was close. There was a whole bunch of us that were in the show that were sitting there in this little section to watch Jerry. And when I saw Tamsin run through the door, I said, okay, something's amiss here. And then I snuck a peek in there, and I saw, okay, oxygen being applied. This doesn't look well. And
I didn't think he was perfect health, by the way. I want to be clear about that. Go on, Rick.
Yeah. So I didn't get to see your the thing you just played, the video, because I just said, okay, this is not going well. And I think there was going to be a party afterward. Actually, I went to some party afterward because I remember talking to Margaret Cho for a while. I can't remember if she was on the show or not.
Margaret was not on this show. I invited her to be in the 2000 version in Edinburgh, or the 2001 version. It wasn't the party back at my flat in Notting Hill, was it? It was just Paul Provenza, and we got Bert. Let's talk to Bert. Let's talk to Bert a little bit more, because
I wasn't there. Sorry.
No, but you've got OJ and Kim waiting in the limo for you, going for lunch. Yeah, you
Not-
weren't there. So, what is your fascination with? Bert, what's your fascination with? I don't want to say people like me because that's totally narcissistic and weird. I don't think you have fascination with me, but the Jerry Lewis thing. He's fascinating. Everything you said before about him perhaps being the greatest entertainer of the 20th century. I find myself constantly in the position of having to justify to other comedians, especially people who just fucking hate Jerry Lewis and his comedy, and they don't get it. I'm not saying that everything he did was hilarious.
Right. There's
To me.
two kinds of people in this world, as I think Jerry Seinfeld said: those who get Jerry Lewis and those who don't. You know, I like the idea of the fact that Jerry Lewis is hated by so many people when he did so much good in the world. He did so much good as an entertainer, and let alone as a humanitarian. And the fact that so many entertainers are very different from what they put on camera, what you see or hear their music, their lives are much different. You know, Jerry was out there. This was a guy who was a star when he was about 17 years old, at a time when most of the comedians were people, you know, Jack Benny's age and Bob Hope's age. They were in their 40s and 30s, and you know, Jerry was a kid, and he basically grew up through all those years in show business. You know, he had the childhood to blame, etc. But getting back to my love of Jerry Lewis is he always makes me laugh. And I think part of it has to do with, you know, first having approached that, first having been subjected to it when I was a kid, when I was, you know, 7 years old. You know, the first time I saw Nutty Professor, or the first time I saw The Bellboy. I wasn't, you know, a film student. I was a kid, you know, at a matinee. And, you know, Jerry Lewis was always part of, you know, there was the Beatles, there was Jerry Lewis, and there was Soupy Sales. And that was sort of the triumvirate as a kid growing up, you know, in the suburbs of Connecticut.
Yeah, I got two out of those three. But
You don't
admittedly,
like the Beatles?
yeah, they sucked. They just were, you know, ripping off all the rock and rollers. I remember that we, when I was probably about 9 or 10, we all went to see Visit to a Small Planet, where he played Creton from whatever, and there were some very funny moments in that. Just, you know, and you know, for a long time, and I remember his lip syncs on television when he'd lip sync Mario Lanza and just do these amazing facial, you know, and that's, I remember in the video that Steven showed before supposedly bringing out Jerry. There was a video montage of some of Jerry's greatest stuff, and most of it I had never seen before, but it still showed just amazingly what a physical specimen he was, and what he could.
Let me take a bank shot from Rick's emotion point here, an intellectual observation, and throw it over to Bert with a spin.
Okay.
Not that I'm looking for justification, but understanding. Is it possible that Jerry knew he was a genius? I mean, of course that's possible, but that part's possible. But that his frustration came because when people didn't treat him like one, he just didn't have time to explain to them why they're wrong, and just would rather, you know, shout at them because his mind is too busy, you know, making genius stuff. I don't have time to deal with idiots. Is that a justification?
Sounds like Trump, actually.
Right. Well, it's not a justification, but it's an explanation. I think.
Yeah.
Jerry was a genius. He was an unheralded genius. People saw his it was comedy, first of all, and not drama. And it was a comedy that he would say, "I'm making a movie for kids. My movies, you know, don't have great plots because I want a movie where a mother can drag her kid into the film 10 minutes late and you can get in, you're still watching the movie. You don't have to sit here and, you know, watch the opening credits." His stuff got worse and less cohesive as his life went on, but that's what he was doing. He was making, you know, he was sort of, I don't want to compare him to somebody like Adam Sandler, but you look at Adam Sandler's movies as an adult and you say, this guy's ruining cinema. This guy is terrible. But then again,
you can tell
the 9-year-olds are loving it. And that's
influence too, that Adam Sandler is clearly a Jerry Lewis fan. You know,
Well, I
then
spoke with
again,
Adam a
so is
few
Martin
times.
Scorsese, and so
Yeah.
so is Robert De Niro, and so is Jim Carrey, etc. So he had great influence, but because of, I think, his acerbic personality, which he didn't hide in his interviews. When you see some of his interviews from the 70s and the 80s, he's so pretentious and so pompous. It's hilarious. This is Jerry Lewis, but those are all different elements that Jerry Lewis had. It's funny. I was looking back at the documentary we did, and there's a scene where Jerry's in the production office, and Terry Gibbs comes through, and Terry Gibbs was a band leader, a vibe player. And he had a big band. And he would play the vibes, and he was terrific. And he meets Terry Gibbs, and they stop and they embrace. And Jerry's like, "Oh, ba da ba 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 ba," and he remembers the song, and they're going back and forth. "Jerry, you're the greatest. You're the greatest." Terry Gibbs is 97 years old now, and he's got a YouTube video out called "My Friend" with a question mark, Jerry Lewis, and the picture on the preview says Jerry Lewis prick. So Terry Gibbs at 97 is still going back to remember, what a prick Jerry Lewis was to him. And but in showbiz, when you saw them in that showbiz situation, they were the closest friends. So I think there were reasons why Jerry was not loved. Of course, I mean, he was the ultimate, ego as well.
I was starting to think that he at one point wanted to join the Rat Pack, or there was something like that.
According to Sean Levy, his book in comedy, the Rat Pack, which was Sinatra and Peter Lawford and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. and Joey Bishop, were invited to the White House to hang out with Jack Kennedy, and Jerry was excluded from the Rat Pack, but somehow he snuck into the White House. In other words, showed up at the White House and go, "I'm Jerry Lewis, let him in," and sort of hid in the next room in the same way that Jay Leno went down to Key Biscayne or whatever when the NBC executives were deciding who to replace Carson, and he was excluded from the Rat Pack. He was purposefully excluded from the Rat Pack.
Well, because of Dean. That Frank was, Dean hated him. Dean didn't want anything to do with him, and so that was part of it. Frank said,
that was only about 5 or 6 years after they'd split.
Away. Yeah.
So
the first thing that Jerry did when I met him on his yacht, first thing he did was take a flash photo of me, and he was just sitting there at the computer, big, overweight, Jabba the Hutt computer with post-it notes all around, as you can imagine. And then I come in, and he's at his desk in the cabin of the yacht, and he's writing his memoir, Dean and Me, and handing me pages to read and telling me stories about him and Marilyn Monroe and Peter Lawford and blah, blah, blah. And trying to impress me. And then he got into like the main story. This is before I came down there to talk business, to invite him onto the show. And then he tells me this story about Steven Spielberg and E.T. Do you know this story, Bert?
No,
I don't either.
Tell us. What's the story?
So, according to Jerry, E.T. was making its world premiere in Cannes in 1982 or 83. And the film ends, standing ovation. Spielberg walks out, standing ovation, won't stop, standing ovation, won't stop. Spielberg sees Jerry in the balcony, in the king's balcony, as it were, and turns to Jerry and does this, as if, this is what Jerry put it to me. He said, as if Steven Spielberg was saying to me that E.T. wouldn't have happened were it not for me. And Jerry then stands up and bows, and the place erupts. That's what the first story. Now, why would such a legend want such a schnook to be impressed? He's already got the job. I invited him.
Yeah,
that's Jerry.
That's just the story he greets everybody with.
Mr. Lewis, telegram. So there I was. But he seemed to always want to impress me with stuff. And it wasn't like he was trying to impress me. It was like he was just, I know a lot of people in Hollywood who do this, including me sometimes, I admit, where you think you're trying to explain something to someone, who you are, what you've done, or what you're working on. But really what it is, you're just trying to impress them with you and your status, and so don't fuck with me, don't treat me like an idiot. But then it just really reveals itself to be, I'm just reminding myself that I'm not, I'm impressing myself. It seems like that's the psychological underpinnings of what goes on with that, and I see it a lot with comics. Poor souls out there buzzing around like hungry, thirsty bees for comedy honey. But but the thing is that what I want people to really understand is that I was trapped. It wasn't just a business decision that I just spent 30-40 grand on advertising Jerry Lewis, on letting everyone know, on building it up, and and now I'm deep into this shit because of money. It wasn't just a money thing. It was, I became, I don't want to say a Stockholm syndrome type of syndrome, not pin number, but it became a burden upon me. I was conscious of it, at least, so it wasn't a syndrome. I was conscious of the fact that nobody gave a shit about him, and it was proved over and over and over again. When I ran into Jackie Mason at Kate Manalini's, and I happened to had been dating his lovely blonde assistant for a while, and he was sitting there with her, and so she says, "Hi. What are you doing, Stephen?" "Well, I'm producing another High on Laughter in London Palladium this time. We got Jerry Lewis and Jackie Mason." He goes, "Run. You don't want Jerry Lewis. There'll be nothing but trouble. Run. Don't even look back. Keep going." And Lee Salters, the great publicist who, as you know, Bert, was probably the greatest publicist Hollywood has ever seen. Grew up with my father in Williamsburg when he was Nussie Cohen. And I hired Lee to do the publicity on some things before. And so when Jerry Lewis pulled out of the show the second time and refused to do the press, and I saw that nobody in England remembered Jerry Lewis except people that were pretty old. Now the most important one of them has died this morning. And they thought I was bringing over Jerry Lee Lewis, and Jerry was, so I went to Lee, "What do I do?" And he said, what do you mean? And I said, "I'm producing a live television show at the London Palladium, and we're honoring Jerry Lewis." And he said, "What are you, crazy? Are you nuts?" Even Lee Salters. And the more people said that to me, my thick, stupid, hairy, furry head thought, well, you know what?
Well,
they didn't like me in Hollywood either.
You'll prove
London loves me. So what do they know? But that didn't even matter. That was my ego just buzzing around like a fly, still looking for shit to eat. It was not that. It was the fact that what do I do as a producer? And Lee Salters came up with the most genius answer. He said, "Tell Jerry you're holding a press conference in London and you want to know why he's not doing the show." And I thought, aha. So I didn't call up Jerry. I called up Max. I referred to them in my mind as the two-headed monster. And I said, called up Max, and it was like this. I said, "Max." He goes, "What do you want?" I said, "Max, I can sue both of you, but I won't. Instead, tell Jerry I'm holding a press conference. I want to know why he's not doing the show." And 2 minutes later, Jerry calls me up. "Hey, Bubbla, booby. So, I mean, when you stood up to Jerry, he was very, very sweet. But then what he did was he would then plot to go even deeper and lower, because little did I know what lay ahead at the London Palladium. Him having to apologize. This is it, Bert. It's like, you're a psychologist here. You're Dr. Phil and Jerry Lewis. Yeah. And so the question really is, it seemed the psychological paradigm, Bert, that I was dealing with was every time I would stand up to Jerry Lewis when I had to, not about my ego, but you have to do the press, or I need to know whether you're in the show or not, all that stuff. When you stood up to him, he got really sweet and impish and childish and cooperative and charming. But then he plotted something even deeper and more evil. It seemed. That's how it worked out for me.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Out of it, though. No, that's
sorry.
You being a writer and you being a producer, and look what you got out of this. People have been, hurt by Jerry Lewis and hurt by other show business figures, and people have lost money with Jerry Lewis. But you got a script out of it. You got a show out of it. You got something you're talking about 20 years later, and people are talking about 20 years later. So I don't need
I don't need consolation. I appreciate that.
Not consolation, but you got something. You got something good out of this because of who you are, because of what you do. You've got a great story out of this.
It is mentioned in his Wikipedia entry.
Yeah.
Well, you want to know something? Originally, this is interesting. Andy Lederer, who was going to be on the show, actually, unbeknownst to me, set up this Wikipedia entry for me. And the wording is, High on Laughter Show, London Palladium, which Jerry couldn't perform due to illness. It was, doesn't say the truth. He faked his collapse. Mm-hmm. But in Jerry's Wikipedia, it's, big long Wikipedia in performances or illness section, it had a link to my show. Once Jerry was aware on the internet, or as people were aware, I was now talking on the internet about him. That part was removed from that he had anything to do with me from his Wikipedia entry.
Another interesting thing about that is the fact that Jerry Lewis, was going to get this award at the Palladium may have made news in some entertainment magazines or Variety, but his collapse got him headlines around the world. That's another thing to remember. With Jerry, talk about Lee Salters and publicity. Jerry was, the lead story on the BBC. And you can still look now and you can see on the news sites that Jerry Lewis collapsed backstage. Had he, he died, he would have made our book.
You're right. But there's two things about this. You're right. We have I think in one of our iterations of the screenplay, and I think probably the current one, is that Jerry has a fantasy conversation with the Stephen character, which is me, and says, look, I knew if I fell at the right propitious time, it would help your show more than anything. And, there is that, looking at the bright side of life. But at the same time, I was humiliated and embarrassed and frightened worldwide by this publicity.
Oh, I don't think he did the publicity for you. It was for, I don't think he cared. I think it was for him. Jerry Lewis was getting, he wasn't trying to publicize the show. He was just, getting some ink for Jerry Lewis.
I know. That's why I said it's a fantasy part of our script. But
right. Yeah, sure.
So, look, there was conversations I had with Jerry on his yacht and on the phone later on, where it wasn't just going to be this show. Brian, I don't know if you know about this, but Jerry asked me if I could set up filmmaking classes for him in England and Europe. And I knew film people over there, and I was already working on it. And I as somehow a media representation of America at a censorship press conference news dialogue at the ICA on the mall of Buckingham Palace, I represented America in this panel. And I had some credible people in the press at the Evening Standard and Malcolm Hay at Time Out. And I was a BBC correspondent for the Fred Macaulay comedy show. And so I had some cred in terms of speaking for America at the time. I know that sounds nuts, but I did. And so I was absolutely serious in making these moves to make a phone call here and there to say, hey, it's like what I did with Carl Gottlieb, my good friend who wrote the movie Jaws. 7 years ago, I think, was the 40th anniversary of the film. So the New Beverly Cinema, the Aero Cinema in Santa Monica, and the Egyptian were running Jaws. And I just simply called up the theaters and said, hi, my name's Steve Allen Green. A friend of mine wrote the screenplay. Would you like a Q&A with him in introducing the film, and then Q&A with he and me after? And they said, yes. That's all I was doing. I would be calling up and saying, I'm producing a show at the London Palladium. In other words, I'm paying for Jerry to come to England, to Europe. I'm taking care of his accommodations. He's going to be over there doing this thing September 8th at the London Palladium. And I think I was calling up like London Film School, whatever it was, or maybe even in Paris, because I had met with the French Film Commission. I got Jerry Lewis. Can we arrange? Can you guys put it together? Tell me what to do. I don't want to be a pain in the ass. It should just be simple, because that's how those things usually work, right? You just let person know who could. Oh yeah, we have a little auditorium. We'd love to have it. So it was no big deal. But that's what's gotten lost, is that I was doing all this other stuff for him and I really wanted him to succeed. I felt forgotten and old. That's how Hollywood made me feel. And I'm sorry, it did. And I had to go to another country to get some recognition, like Jerry Lewis. And so I completely identified with him. Now, did I go so far as to say, I'm a comedy genius too? No. Did I go so far as to say, yeah, I've lost my temper with lots of people and that's what got me in trouble? Yes. So that was my sin. My sin was showing anger at the Improv through a prank. My sin was yelling at some comedy producer who made me drive out to Claremont and didn't have a microphone for my guitar, so I died and it was their fault. And I'd yell at them. Yeah, that was my sin. That's why this has such resonance for me. That's why I do sometimes think that there is something beyond my comprehension about what is causing all these coincidences and things to happen the way I see them, unless it's just that psychological thing of filling in the blanks that we all do. The dress, whether it's purple and white or black and orange on the internet, we psychologically read things into it. But then every once in a while, there's something that happens, like the death of the Queen. I know it's just coincidence, but is it? I don't really think it's beyond that. But anyway, I was look. I was an idiot and I was a loudmouth. Okay, I was an idiot and I was a loudmouth. Ask anybody. I was a nice guy, but I sometimes lost my shit, and I had a lot of psychological reasons, family reasons, and all kinds of stupid things. But that's, I think, why I think Jerry Lewis was kind of my punishment and my guardian angel at the same time. He was my Clarence. He jumped over the bridge, and I jumped in to save him.
Wow.
Well,
Jesus, Stephen, you're fucked up.
So did Jerry get his wings?
No, he's got, they're a little back ordered, buffalo wings and some, anyway.
But I tell you.
Yeah. I truly felt bad for him.
Yeah. Bert, when you encountered him, were your meetings mostly pleasant?
I'm one of those people who can say he was always nice to me.
Yeah.
But the reason was I approached him as a fan. I was a managing editor of a television show, a nightly television show called A Current Affair, and where we were able to basically cover any stories we wanted to cover. So I wrote Jerry a letter, and I explained to him what happened 2 years earlier when I took a job as a PA at the telethon, and I told him that I'd also spent a lot of time collecting copies of an album he made in 1956 called Jerry Lewis Just Sings. It was a straightforward standards album that he did, and this was before it was released on
I will show you. I'll pull out the.
Rick is a record collector. He probably has it, right? Rick?
Yeah.
Well, I don't have
the collect them,
but I do.
10 copies.
I have the single of "Rockabye Your Baby" with the Dixie melody on Decca Records. So, if you give me like 2 minutes, I'll find it. And
I had a copy of 45 of Maury Amsterdam singing "Cheese and Crackers" when I was a kid.
There you go.
And that must have been on. Was it on Decca Records or Capitol?
Brian, I was 6.
Jerry was on Decca, yeah.
Jerry was on Decca.
But I had told him that I had that and I wanted to give him a copy of it. And I asked him, I said, can I bring a camera crew and hang out with you and cover you before the telethon? And I got a phone call, a couple of days later. This is Jerry Lewis. And I was like, whoa, Jerry. And he said, I don't even have a copy of Jerry Lewis Just. And he said, I asked 2 things for you. He says, first of all, I don't want to just have a 5-minute segment on the show. I said, Jerry, we'll do a whole show based, the day after Labor Day, no problem. And that was it. He said, you have my full cooperation. My crew has been told to just do whatever you want and come along. And so we did. And we were waiting for him at the venue. It was done at a sports complex in Las Vegas. This was the first time it wasn't done in a hotel or a casino. And he came in driving in that Rolls Royce of his with jazz music playing. There it is, "Rockabye Your Baby" on deck. Wow. And everything. That's terrific.
Yes. And B-side is "Come Rain or Come Shine."
Terrific. There you go.
Which is interesting because that's what Martin Scorsese used, but he used the Ray Charles version on the opening sequence and credits of King of Comedy.
Yeah.
Interesting too about "Rockabye Your Baby" with the Dixie melody was the first chart single for Aretha Franklin.
Oh,
Was
wow.
it? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
All right. So one of Jerry's demands was the orchestra. Now, Jerry said to me he wants it, listing the things that he wants, 36-piece orchestra. And you got to remember, I'm producing a charity, and I'm doing the minimum that I did for all my comics that I brought over from America was business class and a hotel at the Kensington Hilton, reasonable hotel. But for my stars, it was first class, and the shows in Edinburgh were at the 5-star Caledonia Hotel, and this show in London was at the 5-star Dorchester that Jerry requested. But he wanted a 36-piece orchestra, and I was calling Peter Graham in England, who was my showrunner, who runs my comedy club, my home club, I think I call it, in London. And he said, Stephen, that's way too much money. You know what that's going to cost you? He said, you just need an 18-piece orchestra. And so we priced that out, and it was around £10,000. That was for showing up for 2 o'clock rehearsal, which Jerry was very late to, and didn't bring his music, and then performance. So around $18,000 down the drain. And so, but my point is that Jerry wanted. We talked about this over and over and over again. He was going to do three numbers. He was going to do "Cute," which I think is a jazz number that goes, da, 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 right, Bert?
Da, 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 da.
Oh, that's it. And then he does funny stuff. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Bum, 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 bum.
That's right. So he was going to do a comedy song. I thought that's great. I got Rick Wright, who's doing his comedy musician. I've got Zach Galifianakis, who's at the piano, and and me with my guitar, and Boothby Graffo, another comedian who was a guitarist, and Earl Oaken. So it was part of the agenda of High on Laughter was to show music and comedy working together, and so the other two songs were Carolina, which I think is the Nothing Could Be Finer Than to Be in Carolina. So I think that was the one that made famous in my head by Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore. And the third one was Smile, the one written by his friend Chaplin.
Chaplin, yes.
Smile, though your heart is breaking. So something like this is important to someone like Jerry Lewis. We talked about the details. I provided him an orchestra to do his thing. I provided him the London Palladium. I provided him an audience of close to 2,000. I provided him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And how could he forget his sheet music? Let's just start right there. How could that be forgotten?
Did he leave hotel?
Yet in yelling at me when I asked him about his sheet music, he yelled at me and the entire crew when we're setting up. He says, you hung up on me once, he shouted at me. So he remembered me hanging up on him about a month earlier, but he didn't remember his sheet music.
Yep. Did he acknowledge it was like he left it in the hotel room? Or
I thought he'd be reasonable. I thought we were collaborating. Like I said to him, Jerry, should I call someone? I know it's Sunday night, but it's like noon in Vegas. Is there someone we can call to get a copy faxed over, or emailed at the time, 2002? Yeah, I thought there'd be some collaboration with me, but he was so pissed off at me the whole time. There was no collaboration.
Yeah.
And I should have seen this coming. When I first met with him, he was very gracious to accept my invitation, but then it morphed very imperceptibly to, so this is what we're going to do to honor me.
yeah.
So, I mean, it's just astounding what he remembered and what he didn't. Well, how could he forget? If you were being honored and you had someone provide an orchestra for you, wouldn't you be thinking about, I can't wait to get on the old Palladium stage again and sing these songs? And, why would he forget his music?
Yeah.
I don't think people understand that I said to Peter, I said, well, can't they improvise? He goes, Stephen, they're 18 musicians. They don't improvise.
Yes,
well.
they need the sheet music.
They need the fucking sheet music. Of course, I don't think the internet was the internet at the time, or we didn't have access to it, or we didn't think it. We probably could have downloaded it at the time, maybe. but there was so much panic going on, and his disc cooperation.
Back then, downloading took about 10 minutes per page or something like that.
Yeah, it's like, are you kidding? We used a coal fire to print. Bert, let me ask you a question. From what you've seen, does it seem to you like I tried to do everything I can to please this guy and make a professional, good show, and B, did I reasonably know what I was doing? Honestly,
no, it seems that everything was in place. Everything was moving forward. The show went on. Everything was in place but Jerry Lewis, and he was very unpredictable at the time. You don't know what sort of medication he was taking, what sort of anger he was holding in. He obviously was quite at odds with not just you but everyone else around him. And it's yeah, it seems that you were left excuse me. You were left to the whims.
Every performer did really well. You know, the audience is very receptive of the performers. You know, we all had good sets. So
the show did go on, and speaking of the show going on, and was an exceptional show. And thanks, Rick, and you were great. And Earl Oken has said the same thing, and I thought I did pretty well considering what pressure I was under. But this is a book that Bert wrote with Jeff Abraham called "The Show Won't Go On," which I've read, which is a really funny book. Tell us about this book, if you would be so kind, Bert.
That's good.
Well, this is a book that Jerry could have been in had he gone all the way and died on stage. It's a book about performers who died on stage.
Tommy Cooper.
Tommy Cooper has a chapter. There's a good British contingent in the book, including Sidney James, who died on stage, and I think Bob Morecambe from Morecambe and Wise. There's
an opera singer named Leonard Warren who died on stage in the early 60s.
Leonard died in our book as well. Yeah,
yep.
We Jeff had come up with the idea, and he'd come up with the title about 12 years earlier, and stopped over one day and said, "Here, I have this idea for a book about performers who died on the way to a show, who died on the way home from a show, who died on stage, who died backstage." And I said, "Let's do the research. Let's do it." All he had was the title, "The Show Won't Go On." We got to over 1,000 entries and said, I think we can narrow this down to performers who died on stage.
Yeah, because Hank Williams was doomed to do a show, but that would have been one.
And then we had to narrow it down further because we had people who died on camera, people who died while making films, while making television shows. And we got it down to people who died in front of an audience, or whether it's in a theater or an arena, a radio audience, a live television.
Was there ever an execution?
There was an execution, yes, of a television reporter and her cameraman, which only happened a few years ago. She was doing a live shot in the morning, and a disgruntled former employee came up behind the cameraman with his gun in his shot and killed her on live television. We had a couple of executions there. There was a couple of suicides on stage.
Yeah, there was a news reporter in the 70s who.
Hey, Shyd, I'm doing the.
Shot herself.
Yes, we have her story as well. So
join in. We got Bert Kearns.
The problem that we had.
Want to go to Facebook?
Yeah, I sent you the link.
The problem we had with the book was that people continued to die on stage as we were in the publication process, and the latest one, right before the book was going to print, was a comedian named Ian Cognito.
I know Ian. He was on my second High on Laughter.
Yep, he was, and Ian was performing at a club in a pub, and he said, "Imagine if suddenly I had a stroke and then began speaking Welsh," and then he sat down, put his head on his chin on his chest, and died on stage. That's one of the worst things you can do, is die on stage as a comedian, because people think it's part of the act and people think it's a joke.
What about Dick Shawn? That's a great story, right? Dick Shawn.
Yeah. Dick Shawn was wilder because he was such a great comedian, such an innovative pioneer in comedy. People don't realize that. They know him from The Producers, or they know him from It's a Mad World. But he was really a predecessor to an Andy Kaufman, or even Gary Shandling said he was a great influence on him. He did a show called The Second Greatest Entertainer in the Whole Wide World.
I saw it in New York. I saw it in San Francisco. Yeah.
So he was doing a version of that at the University of California in San Diego in an auditorium there because he wanted to bring the show to the Kennedy Center. And as you know, he started his show. The stage would be filled with rubble and newspapers, and he'd be lying down underneath the newspapers. The audience would file in, the stage lights would dim, and he'd rise up from the newspapers. People didn't know he was on the stage. When he went into intermission, he'd say something like, "Excuse me, I'm going to take a nap." And he would lie down throughout intermission. So the word went out to the stagehands, etc. Should he collapse on stage, it's part of the act. Don't go near him. That's what happened. He was doing his usual improv, and he said, imagine if there was a nuclear, let's imagine there was a nuclear war outside, and the only survivors were the people in this theater, and I will be your leader. And then he face planted on the stage and got a few laughs. He stayed down a bit too long. It got a bit uncomfortable. People said, take his wallet. Ha, ha, ha. They were laughing, etc. His son happened to be the director and was at the back of the theater with the headsets on. And he said, Dad doesn't usually fall like that. He took it pretty hard there. Got on the set to the stagehand and said, go out and check on him. Went out and checked on him. Said he doesn't seem to be breathing. All hell broke loose. As it happened, the theater was right next to a hospital. It was a teaching hospital. The audience was full of doctors, and they went up, but they couldn't revive him. And while the rescue attempts were going on, people were walking up to the lip of the stage and asking for refunds because he didn't finish the show.
Oh,
By the way, I think I don't think we got one refund request.
Yeah.
From my show. In fact, the reviews that came in from the theater, West End theater reviewers like Clive Davis or Davies, was nothing short of the absurdity of an Anthony Schaffer play, who wrote Equus. And it was almost. This was the weird thing. It was almost like Jerry Lewis's non-appearance and dramatic reason for non-appearance, plus all the great comedy. Was more than they bargained for. It was like you had to be there, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe.
Well, boys and girls, I'm going to have to depart.
So do
All
I.
right. Well, listen, Rich, thank you, Brian. Ritch Shydner just called. Maybe he can join us. I'm trying to get him the link. But you're tired. It's 11th. What time is it there now?
It's not that late. Just I have. There's things I normally do on Thursdays that I set aside for.
I appreciate this. I know you're busy, and I'll see you next week for Comedy Dish. Thank you, Brian, Rick Wright, and
nice to meet you. Brian, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Bert, and best of
I
luck.
have to leave as well, Steve. I don't want to leave you hanging here.
Yeah, I was about to say goodnight to everybody. Rich
Okay.
is late. Thank you very much for your time, Bert Kearns. Everybody,
Happy anniversary.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks.
20 years ago today. Okay.
Say hi to Jeff.
See you later.
Okay, there he's gone. Thanks, Bert.